Hello there and welcome back to Artcana Check, and welcome to a very special video. This is something that I've been planning for a while, and now that I've got the time to sit down and give it the time and effort that is needed for it, I'm finally able to bring this to you. Welcome to GM 101. Now, you're probably asking yourself, what's GM 101? Simply put, GM 101 is going to be a series of videos where I'm going to share the tips, tricks, techniques, other things along those lines that I have learned over the last 6 years that I have been both playing Dungeons & Dragons as well as DMing Dungeons & Dragons. Now, you're going to hear me use the words GM and DM. And what's the difference? Well, a GM stands for Game Master. That is somebody who runs any type of tabletop role-playing game. A DM is a Dungeon Master. This is very specific to Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, it's probably trademarked by Dungeons & Dragons. But that is simply just a Game Master who is doing Dungeons & Dragons. I will probably use the term DM more than I will GM, but know that this is going to be fairly interchangeable. So what do I mean by sharing the tips and techniques and tricks that I've learned? Well, I have learned a number of things: how to make a world immersive, how to really bring your players into the game, how to make their choices matter. And it's these things and a number of other things that I'm going to be breaking down into bite-sized segments so that you're not overwhelmed by all of this. Because Dungeons & Dragons can be overwhelming, especially for people who've not gotten into it. Now, these videos are geared towards people who are GMs or who are wanting to be GMs. So that's, take that with a grain of salt. If you're a player and you're thinking about GMing, hey, great, this can help. Now, what is GM 101 not going to be about? GM 101 is not going to be about the rules. I'm not going to be the rules lawyer, the rules master of that. In fact, Jeremy Crawford, who is the rules master for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, is on camera stating that the rules are just guidelines. But if you are wanting to learn the rules of Dungeons & Dragons and how you can use those as a dungeon master, there are other videos on YouTube that you can watch to learn the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. You can scour the books if you need to. There's certain things like, what happens, in combat and initiative and what dice do what, etc., etc., etc. That's all out there, and that's fairly easy to learn. In fact, I had played one single session of Dungeons & Dragons before I started dungeon mastering for a dozen teenagers. So it can be done. I was definitely not up to snuff on all of the rules. I learned the rules. And even now, hey, I might not know all of the rules. I can go back and check, or guess what? I'm the GM. I can make the rules up. That's one thing you have to learn. If you're the GM, you're the guy making up the rules. So I will probably be using Dungeons & Dragons as the template for this. In fact, you can see I'm wearing a Dungeons & Dragons shirt right now. It's a sweet kind of vintage red dragon shirt. So I will be focusing on D&D because that is generally what I play. But most of these tips can be used in Pathfinder, in the World of Darkness, which is the Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf games, to a certain extent for those. Definitely for Pathfinder, or for many of the other role-playing games that are out there. But, like I said, I'm going to use D&D as my reference point, because that's what I generally play, and that's what I DM. Now, the nice thing about this series is that the videos that are going to be coming out, and they're going to be coming out hopefully on a nice weekly basis, and there's going to be a lot of them. There's going to be at least 16 more videos beyond this kind of introductory video. I might even add more as I go along because I just might think of more things to talk about. But they don't need to be watched in any particular order. If there's something you want to learn about world building, well, there's going to be a video for that. If there's something you want to know about creating NPCs, there's going to be a video for that. So on and so forth. So, let's start out with some very basic things that I can cover here and won't need to really cover later on. Starts. What do you need to start GMing a campaign? Or in Dungeons & Dragons case, what do you need to start to Dungeon Master? Because you can go to your local game store, you can go to a bookstore and find the Dungeons & Dragons section, and there's a lot of books. There are handbooks, there are manuals, there are campaign guides, etc., etc. There's, Dungeon Master screens, there's, dice sets, yada, yada, yada. Lots of stuff. It can be completely overwhelming. And they're not thin books. There's a lot of meat in each of those books. Now, to be perfectly honest, if you are starting out, you don't need to buy a single book. You can look up online something called the SRD. This is the basic rules. This has got some basic monsters, basic classes and races, enough to get you started, and you can use that, and you could only use that, and that would serve you perfectly well. But if you are wanting to start this with more of the full picture, something to let you start and be able to get deep, the 3 core books are always going to be my recommendation. Ugh, like I said, they are not thin books. They're not thin. First up is for you as a GM, is going to be the Dungeon Master's Guide. This has got all sorts of information in there. It's got things on, some subclasses that aren't in other books that can only be found here. There's things about treasure and legendary items. There's, all sorts of tips and whatnot in here, and it's broken down fairly easily. I'll tell you what, I have probably looked at about 10% of this book thoroughly. I usually look at it for the treasure. I like the treasure system. If you're facing, this many enemies, and there's, there are this challenge rating, this is the amount of loot that might be dropped. And then you can play around with that, or looking at what some of these legendary items that have already been written about that you don't have to create yourself. That's really nice with the Dungeon Master's Guide. The other thing as a GM that you are going to probably want is the Monster Manual. This is a great book, great resources of monsters and other creatures that you might fight. So let's just go up to a great one. Green. Yeah, here we go. Hey, look, it's just like my shirt. This is information on the Red Dragon. Specifically, the Ancient Red Dragon. This has got everything from its different stats, like its strength, its dexterity, etc. It tells you things like it's got legendary resistances, which you can use 3 times a day, which means, hey, if it fails a saving throw, you can choose for it to succeed instead. It tells you what actions it can take and how many actions it can take. Legendary actions. Plus, before there's things about its lair. There's things for ancient dragons, adult dragons, young dragons, wormlings. There is lore in here. And this goes for hundreds and hundreds of monsters. Now, there are other books out there, such as Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, Volo's Guide to Monsters, which are supplementary books, and they add a number of more creatures or subsets of creatures. There are also books by a publisher called Kobold Press, and they've got things like the Tome of Foes, which is great. I own Tome of Foes or Tome of Foes 2, I'm not sure which. I've got 2 books by Kobold Press that are monster books. But they're great. They're not completely necessary. You don't have to use them. I still use mainly the monster manual. You can also use that to do things like create your own monsters, which we'll get into later. The third book, which is good for you, and it's even more important for your players, is the Player's Handbook. Now, the Player's Handbook is all about how do the players create their characters. It talks about the races, the classes, feats, weapons, armor, spells, etc. It's got everything you need to build a character. Now, again, in some of the other supplementary books, there are extra things like extra subclasses or even extra just new classes, new races. And they're great. And if you want to really deep dive, buy them, have your players buy them, start a communal fund. Now, I will say this about the books. They all have a retail price of $49.95. And that's pretty much true of all of the supplementary books, etc., etc. And if you go to your local bookstore, you go to your local game store, they're going to sell them at full price. And I love to support my local game stores, but I don't think I've bought a single book from one because it's so expensive. So sue me. I will go to Amazon and I will pick up this book about between 20 and 40% off. $35 for a $50 book. It's hard to compete with that. Sorry, game stores, but that's the truth. They're expensive books. And then if you go into doing things like playing online and using systems like D&D Beyond or Roll20, and you want to really do anything with them, you've got to purchase the books again, but this time in digital format. And they're not cheap either. But if you can limit it to these 3 books, you're going to be good to go for a long time. I would say in most of the games that I DM, which is with my high school students, my middle school and high school students, I generally don't ever veer away from these 3 books. Maybe I touch here and there, but not by much. The other thing you're going to need, obviously, are people to play the game. Friends, acquaintances, people you might meet at a comic book store or game store who have an interest in playing. It all depends. The more you know the people, the more friendly you are with the people, usually the smoother things will go. But, you can also use it as a way to make new friends. In my case, I do it with a lot of my students. And you get some real interesting groupings of people. I find that the younger they are, the more murder hobos they are. They just want to go out there and kill everything in sight. The older they are, the more risque they tend to be. That's putting it mildly. Granted, a number of my friends that I play with, and that I DM for right now with online gaming, can be worse when it comes to the risque business. But have people to play the game with. People that also really want to play. That's a big thing. If they're real hesitant, after a few sessions, maybe D&D's not for them. Maybe role-playing games just not hitting it for them. But usually if you can get them hooked and hook them fast, they'll be fans for life and they'll really get into the game. The last thing you're going to need are dice. Lots and lots of dice. A normal RPG, be it Pathfinder or D&D, set includes a D20, which is a 20-sided die, a 12-sided die, 2 10-sided dice, which can be used for percentages, an 8-sided dice, a 6-sided dice, and a 4-sided dice. The 4-sided dice are a D4. It's like a little pyramid. Please don't step on them. It will hurt you greatly. The D20 is kind of what Dungeons & Dragons is really known for. That's the one that Dungeons & Dragons uses a lot. Now, games like Werewolf or Vampire the Masquerade runs on the D10 system, where the only dice you're going to need are D10s. And I am just getting into playing Werewolf. I had played the first session this last weekend, which was just building our characters. But even with that, to do certain things, we had to roll some D10s, or to learn how things worked, we sample rolled D10s. And my game master for that had over 100 D10s ready to go just for fun. But once you get into getting dice, you start collecting dice, and it becomes a habit. My favorite dice are either the brass dice that I have or the turquoise gemstone dice that I have. Real nice. You start getting nice dice, you start getting nice dice holders, and that goes on, and it becomes just as expensive, if not more so, than buying all the D&D books. So, in conclusion for this, because I don't want to keep this too long, it's already gone on probably longer than I would like, because I'm rambling a little. No script for this episode. But if this is the only video in this series you watch, now you know the basics of becoming a GM. You could begin with this, but stick around. You're going to learn a lot of just little details and stuff. And guess what? I'm not the only one who's done videos like this, and my tips might not be something that you're interested in, but you won't know until you see. You might use some of it, you might use all of it, you might use none of it. But stick around, because we're going to have a lot of tips, we're going to have a lot of tricks, and it's going to be a wild ride to see what this does to, make your game a whole lot better. So until next week, this is GM 101 on Artcana Check. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this video, hit that notification bell. Gotta say it. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.